Her fingers were cold when they closed around his, and for the first time in his life, Ronan Gallagher didn't know what to do. The most feared man in Chicago, 34 years old, a ruthless boss whose gray eyes could silence a room full of dangerous men, sat hunched in a plastic chair beside a hospital bed, holding the hand of his young secretary like it was the only thing keeping him on this earth. Tessa Monroe, 27 years old, had collapsed right in front of his desk just hours earlier. He had carried her through the emergency room doors himself, shouting at doctors and ignoring every rule. Now, as the machines beeped softly and her eyes finally fluttered open, the ruthless boss remained frozen. In his world, money could buy anything, and power could fix any problem. But nothing in his empire had prepared him for the silent agony of the woman who had spent 2 years standing by his side without ever asking for a single thing. Why had this woman with the gentle smile been hiding a secret painful enough to bring her down right at his feet? And what would a man like him, a man everyone feared but nobody truly knew, do when he discovered the heartbreaking truth behind her quiet life? If you love stories where the coldest hearts get melted in ways money can't buy, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Share this video with someone who still believes love shows up when we least expect it. And leave a comment telling us where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's go back to where it all began, 12 hours earlier, on the 40th floor of Gallagher Holdings, on an ordinary Chicago morning that had no idea what was coming. Up on that 40th floor, however, the morning had begun in a terrifying silence. The vast office looked out over the whole of Chicago as the city stirred awake, its skyscrapers glittering beneath the early sunlight. Yet no one in the room dared turn his eyes toward that view. 7 men stood in a line along the dark wood-paneled wall, and in their midst, a man named Marsh was trembling like the last leaf of autumn, sweat soaking the collar of his shirt even though the air in the room was bitterly cold. Ronan Gallagher sat behind his desk without looking at Marsh, slowly turning the pages of a thin file. He didn't need to raise his voice. He never had, because in his world, Ronan's silence was more frightening than any man's roar. At last, he closed the file, lifted his gaze, and let those gray eyes settle upon Marsh's bloodless face. In an even voice, he asked whether it was true that Marsh had gone to the Callahan family's diner on the South Side, a modest place an elderly husband and wife had spent their entire lives building, and demanded money from them in exchange for being allowed to run their business in peace. Marsh stammered, trying to explain that it had only been a small amount, that everyone in their line of work did the same thing. Ronan raised one finger, and the excuse died in the man's throat. He rose, walked around the desk, and each slow footstep echoed across the wooden floor like the ticking of a clock, counting down the final seconds. He said that the Gallagher family had only a handful of rules, and the first, the one carved into the bones of the organization before Marsh had even learned how to hold a razor, was that they never touched the livelihood of honest people. Marsh collapsed to his knees and begged for mercy, swearing that he would return 10 times the money. Ronan merely tilted his head and regarded him as if he were looking at a stain on the carpet, then turned toward Quinn Donnelly, who stood silently beside the window. He said no one was to strike Marsh. No one was to touch so much as a single hair on his head. But beginning the next morning, every bank in the city would close his accounts, every landlord would terminate his lease, and every door that had ever opened for him would close forever, because Ronan didn't need to punish a man. He only needed the entire city to forget that the man had ever existed. 2 men helped Marsh out of the room, his legs limp beneath him as though every bone had vanished from his body, and the office sank into a silence so thick that no one dared break it. At that very moment, the heavy wooden door opened without a warning knock. All 7 men held their breath at once, because that door was always locked against the entire world, locked against business associates, locked against attorneys, locked even against those who had shed blood for the Gallagher family, and anyone who dared cross its threshold without permission had to pay the price. But the person who entered was Tessa Monroe, the secretary with neatly pinned brown hair and a gentle smile, carrying a small tray in her hands, and she walked straight through a room filled with dangerous men, as calmly as if she were crossing an empty schoolyard. She set a cup of hot tea on the desk, placed a stomach pill beside it, then folded her arms and looked at Ronan with the expression of a schoolteacher who had caught a student avoiding his homework. She told him that he had skipped his pill that morning, that she had counted how many remained in the bottle, so he shouldn't bother arguing, and that she would stand right there until he had swallowed it. The 7 men witnessed a sight they would recount over drinks for years to come. The man who had just erased someone from society with a single sentence now quietly picked up the pill, swallowed it with a sip of tea, and even lowered his head slightly like an obedient schoolboy. Tessa nodded in satisfaction, collected the tray, reminded him that his meeting with the East Coast associates would begin in 1 hour, then left, gently closing the door behind her. No one in the room dared look Ronan directly in the eye, but Quinn, who had served the Gallagher family since Ronan's father was still alive, let the corner of his mouth lift as he concealed a smile. He was the only one who understood that in this entire sprawling empire, among the docks, the buildings, and the men willing to die at the slightest nod of Ronan's head, there was only one person who had never been afraid of Ronan Gallagher, and cruelly enough, she was also the only person he would never dare to hurt. That afternoon, the most important meeting of the year at Gallagher Holdings was underway in the grand conference room, where partners from the East Coast sat around the long table with thick stacks of contracts that could change the entire future of the company. Ronan sat at the head of the table, listening to every number and every clause, his gray eyes missing no detail, until the conference room door opened and Tessa entered carrying the additional files he had requested. At that very moment, something made him stop in the middle of a sentence. Her face was as white as paper. Beads of sweat glistened across her forehead even though the corridor outside was bitterly cold, and the hand holding the files trembled in faint waves, the kind of trembling an ordinary person wouldn't have noticed, but Ronan did, because he had spent 2 years committing every smallest gesture of this woman to memory. He asked whether she was all right, and Tessa gave him her familiar smile, the smile she always used to reassure the entire world, saying that she was only a little tired and that he should continue the meeting. But when she turned toward the door, her legs suddenly gave way beneath her like a violin string that had been cut. The files scattered across the floor, and her body collapsed onto the carpet only a few steps from his table. The entire room went still. Ronan couldn't remember how he had risen from his chair. He knew only that the heavy leather chair behind him crashed to the floor, and in an instant, he was kneeling beside her, calling her name, gently shaking shoulders that were growing colder, then seeing a thin line of blood seep from the corner of her mouth and stain the collar of his white shirt as he swept her into his arms. One of the partners spoke up to remind him that the contract still hadn't been signed, and Ronan didn't even turn his head. He merely told the entire room that they could sign it or tear it apart, because he didn't care, then tightened his arms around Tessa and rushed into the corridor toward the chairman's private elevator. The elevator plunged downward, but midway through the descent, it slowed and came to a complete stop at one of the floors according to its programming. The metal doors slid open, and the group of employees waiting outside had barely taken half a step forward when they met the eyes of the man holding the unconscious woman in his arms. He didn't say a word or make a single gesture. He only looked at them, and the entire group retreated as though an invisible hand had pushed them back. One person even lowered his head and stared at the toes of his shoes until the doors closed again. In the underground garage, Ronan laid Tessa across the back seat, took the wheel himself without waiting for his driver, and sent the black car roaring out of the building. He sped through every intersection without regard for red lights or green, the blaring horns behind him swallowed by the pounding of his heart, and throughout the entire drive, he kept speaking to her through the rearview mirror, telling her to hold on, telling her she wasn't allowed to leave without asking his permission, while the voice of the coldest crime boss in Chicago shattered into pieces with every turn. At the hospital emergency entrance, he carried her through the automatic doors, and the nurse on duty had barely begun talking about admission procedures, insurance documents, and the required waiting process when Ronan gently placed Tessa on the nearest stretcher, pulled out his phone, and made a single call. No one heard what he said. The call was so brief that there wasn't enough time to finish a sip of water. Yet only minutes later, the elevator doors at the far end of the corridor flew open, and the gray-haired chief of surgery came running out in person, followed by an entire medical team in blue scrubs pushing equipment behind them. The nurse on duty stood there with the paperwork still in her hand, her eyes wide as she stared at the man in the blood-stained white shirt, as though a storm had just swept through her life. The diagnosis came swiftly and without mercy. Tessa's stomach had been perforated by ulcers left untreated for far too long, damage that hadn't formed overnight, but had been building month after month, and she needed surgery immediately. As the stretcher carried her toward the operating room, Ronan walked beside her until he reached the final boundary line, where a sign warned that family members were forbidden to go any farther. There, the man who had just set an entire hospital in motion with one phone call bent down and brushed a loose strand of brown hair away from her pale cheek, and that hand, the hand that had never trembled before the barrel of any gun or the threat of any sentence, now shook like the hand of an old man in the middle of winter. Night descended over the hospital, and the corridor outside the operating room became a prison for a man who had never known what it meant to wait. Ronan sat on a row of hard plastic chairs, his elbows resting on his knees, the dried blood staining his shirt having darkened to the color of rust, while the red light above the operating room sign burned on, refusing to go out. He had once sat through negotiations that lasted the entire night with men who concealed guns beneath the table. He had once faced sentences capable of burying his entire family, yet nothing had ever worn him down the way the ticking second hand of the clock on that white wall did. Unable to endure his helplessness, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He summoned Quinn Donnelly and ordered him to uncover every detail of Tessa Monroe's life, every document, every bill, every doorway she had ever passed through, because he needed to understand why the woman who was always smiling had collapsed in the middle of his office with a body so badly ravaged that the doctors could only shake their heads. Quinn returned after midnight carrying a thin file, and the man who had witnessed every dark corner of the city placed it on the table with a heaviness Ronan had rarely seen in him. Ronan opened it, and every page struck like a hammer blow. His perfect secretary, the woman who remembered every appointment, every contract, and every pill he was supposed to take, was carrying a burden of medical debt heavy enough to break a human life, debt accumulated through years of treatment for her younger sister, Piper, who had suffered from kidney disease for many years and had to visit a dialysis center regularly each week, as faithfully as other people went to church. He kept reading and discovered that Tessa didn't work only for him. After leaving the 40th floor, at the end of each day, she quietly went to a laundromat on the west side for a night shift, folding strangers' clothes until nearly dawn, then returning home to sleep for a few hours before coming back to stand behind him with a smile that didn't show a single crack. The final page was a copy of a medical record, stating that Tessa had once registered to donate one of her kidneys to her sister, but the test results had shown that the two of them weren't compatible, and in the corner of the page was the mark of a water stain that had dried long ago, perhaps left by the tears of the person who had held that paper before him. Quinn stood silently beside him, and for one brief moment, as his gaze passed over Piper's medical records, something flickered across the face of the seasoned man, something resembling the shadow of a very old wound, but he said nothing, and Ronan didn't notice it in time. Then Quinn drew a photograph from his coat pocket and explained that their men had spoken to the landlady of the small apartment Tessa rented, and that she had shown them this while talking about the kindest tenant she had ever known. The photograph showed an old shoebox sitting in the corner of a closet, with its lid open. Inside, worn paper envelopes were arranged in neat rows, each one bearing Tessa's careful, rounded handwriting, and marked with a specific expense: Piper's medicine, dialysis, rent, utilities, and one envelope labeled simply food. Ronan looked more closely and saw something that tightened around his chest. The envelopes set aside for her sister were all bulging, while the envelope for food was paper thin, and according to the landlady, it had been completely empty for weeks. The man who had signed a contract that very morning worth as much as an entire city block, the man who could have purchased the most luxurious restaurant chain in Chicago in a single afternoon, sat beneath the cold fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor, holding a photograph of his secretary's shoebox, and for the first time in all his years as a heartless crime boss, his shoulders began to shake and tears fell onto the paper. There was one final envelope inside the box, lying slightly apart from the others. It was thicker, and the handwriting on it wasn't Tessa's careful, rounded script, but another hand, younger and more uneven, bearing a line that Ronan stared at without understanding: Tessa's Dream Fund. He asked Quinn what the envelope was, and Quinn shook his head, saying that the landlady didn't know either. She knew only that it had been there for a very long time, and that Tessa apparently had never opened it. Ronan sat in silence for a long while, then spoke as though he were talking to himself, saying that she had stood beside him every day for 2 years, yet he hadn't known that she was slowly dying in silence. Quinn looked at the man he had served since Ronan was only a boy, and in the deep voice of a father rather than a subordinate, he spoke the words Ronan would carry with him for the rest of his life. You paid her to memorize everything about you, but you never paid any price at all to learn even one thing about her. Tessa woke at noon the following day, when sunlight slipped through a gap in the curtains and painted a slender ribbon of brightness across the white hospital blanket. She blinked several times and looked around the spacious private room, which she knew with absolute certainty wasn't covered by any level of insurance she possessed. Then her gaze came to rest on the man sitting in the chair beside her bed. He was still dressed in a shirt, though someone had brought him a clean one to replace the blood-stained garment, and his face bore the unmistakable marks of a sleepless night. A nurse entered to check her vital signs, helped her take a few sips of water, informed her that the surgery had been successful, then left, leaving the two of them alone with a silence longer than any negotiation Ronan had ever endured. Tessa looked down at the hand resting on the edge of the blanket, her fingers gently worrying the corner of the fabric, and in a voice still hoarse from the anesthesia, she asked whether he had stayed there all night. Ronan replied that there was nowhere else he needed to be. Something warm flickered in her eyes. Then she drew a very soft breath, gathered all the courage of someone who had just crossed the boundary between life and death, and asked the question she had been rehearsing in her mind ever since she awakened. "While I was unconscious, did I say anything strange?" The room seemed to hold its breath. It was a door standing wide open, and both of them knew what lay beyond it. Ronan Gallagher, the man who had negotiated with the most dangerous men on the East Coast without blinking, the man who could read an opponent's intentions before the other man even opened his mouth, sat there looking into her waiting brown eyes, and in that decisive moment, the old fear within him rose faster than his courage. He heard his own voice choose the safest path, smooth and measured, as though he were reading a clause from a contract. He told her that she had undergone major surgery, that she didn't need to worry about anything, that he would cover the hospital bills, the room, the medication, every expense, including the care her sister needed, and that the only thing she had to do now was rest and recover. Every word fell with precision, generous and cold as coins striking a stone table. The light in Tessa's eyes faded with every sentence, as though someone were slowly turning down a lamp. She looked at him for one more second, waiting for something that never came, then gave a faint nod and said, "Thank you, boss." Those final two words settled between them like a thick pane of glass, and she slowly turned her face toward the wall. Ronan said that he only wanted her to rest without worrying. From beyond the white wall of her silence, her voice came back to him, quiet but clear in every word, without anger, only with a weariness that reached all the way into her bones. "You're very good at paying for things. Everyone in this city knows that. But I wasn't saying those words to your wallet." No accusation could have cut more deeply. Ronan opened his mouth, but no sound came out, because every language he understood, the language of power, of money, of favors and debts, was useless before a woman who needed to hear only one honest sentence. He rose, told her that she should rest, and walked out of the hospital room, closing the door behind him. In the corridor, he leaned against the cold wall and closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, the ruler of an entire empire understood a bitter truth. There were some doors that no phone call, no check, and no army could open, and that door had just closed in his face by his own hand. But instead of turning back and knocking upon it with the naked truth of his heart, the mind of a man accustomed to conquering everything retreated into the familiar path, the only path it knew. He opened his eyes, and in those gray depths, confusion had been replaced by the familiar iron resolve that had once built an empire. He didn't know how to say the words she needed, but he knew how to do what no one else could. And he made a vow to himself, like pressing a seal upon the sentence that would condemn them both. If she wouldn't let him near her heart, then he would protect her in his own way. He would clear every thorn from the road before her, whether she knew it or not, whether she wanted him to or not. 3 days later, Tessa was discharged from the hospital, and only when the car brought her back to her familiar neighborhood did she discover that Ronan had quietly arranged everything while she was still confined to her hospital bed. A brand new apartment in the building directly across from the hospital had already been leased in her name, its key resting inside an elegant paper box beside a card bearing only the words, "This place is closer to the dialysis center." A private nurse had been hired to check on her health every morning, and a car with a driver waited downstairs to take Piper to and from dialysis each week. Everything was perfect, thoughtful, expensive, and not one part of it had been discussed with her. Tessa stood in the middle of the apartment, breathing in the scent of fresh paint as she looked around at luxurious furnishings she had never dared dream of owning, then quietly placed the key back inside the box. The following day, the box was returned to the 40th floor with a brief handwritten letter. In it, she thanked him for his kindness and asked permission to keep only the transportation that took Piper to the dialysis center, because her sister's health wouldn't allow her to refuse it. Everything else, she respectfully returned. The old apartment she shared with Piper might be small, but it was their home, and she was still capable of taking care of her own life, just as she had done for so many years. Ronan read the letter 3 times, unable to understand why anyone would refuse an easier life. And at the end of the week, he decided to drive to the dialysis center himself at the hour Piper's treatment ended, carrying the flimsy excuse that he needed to make sure the car service was performing its duties properly. He met Piper in the waiting area, where the frail 19-year-old sat in a plastic chair with a wool scarf wrapped around her neck, her face pale after dialysis, but her eyes sparkling with a mischievous light that no illness had ever managed to extinguish. She recognized him at once, tilted her head, and studied the tall man in the expensive suit from head to toe, then made a remark that caused the nearby nurses to turn away to hide their smiles. "So this is Tessa's famous boss. You're a little less frightening in person than I imagined." Ronan sat down in the plastic chair beside her, such a peculiar sight that even he didn't seem to realize what he was doing, and asked about her health. He asked whether she needed anything else, a better treatment room, a more skilled doctor, anything at all. Piper watched him for a long moment with the eyes of a child who had grown up in hospitals and become older than her years, then asked whether he truly wanted what was best for her sister. He answered yes without hesitation. The young woman nodded and spoke in a voice as light as air, though every word fell like a boulder. "Then let me tell you something. Other people have spent my sister's entire life making decisions for her. Fate made the decision for her when our parents died. My illness made the decision about her college degree. The people who once promised to love her made their own decisions, and then chose to leave. So the one thing she has never had in her life isn't money or a beautiful home. It's someone willing to sit down and ask her what she wants." Ronan remained silent on that plastic chair for a very long time after the car had taken Piper home, her words piercing the same place Tessa's letter returning the key had touched. But instead of understanding the lesson, the worry within him only grew heavier, because now he knew just how vulnerable the 2 sisters were in this city, and a man like him had far too many enemies. When he returned to his office, he summoned a member of his security team named Boyd, a man in his 30s with a kind, approachable face and an impeccable record of service, then assigned him to watch the sisters from a distance, protecting them from every danger, while making absolutely certain they never realized he was there. In the weeks that followed, Boyd carried out his duty with a devotion that was almost moving. One day, when the weather suddenly turned cold, he pretended to be a passerby and bought Piper a cup of warm milk after seeing her shivering as she waited for the car outside the dialysis center. One afternoon, when the rain came down in sheets, he appeared at just the right moment with a black umbrella and sheltered both sisters all the way from the hospital entrance to their car, then quietly walked away before either of them could offer him a proper thank you. Piper began calling him by the affectionate name Uncle Black Umbrella, while Tessa occasionally caught herself smiling at the thought that perhaps there were still kind strangers left in this city after all. One evening, early in the week, when Tessa had recovered enough to move around the apartment on her own, the doorbell rang in the small home she shared with her sister, and when she opened the door, the sight before her left her frozen for several seconds. Ronan Gallagher, the ruler of an entire empire, stood in the narrow corridor holding an insulated food container, without a suit or tie, wearing only a simple sweater that some assistant had probably been sent scrambling across the city to find. And upon that face, always as cold as stone, was an expression of uncertainty so profound that it bordered on awkwardness. He said he had heard the doctor explain that someone recovering from stomach surgery should eat soft food, that he didn't trust delivered meals, so he had cooked something himself. Tessa looked at the container, then at the man who could have purchased the most luxurious restaurant chain in the city but had chosen to stand in a kitchen for the first time in his life because of a bowl of soup, and she opened the door wider to let him inside without understanding why. Piper was spending that night at the home of a friend from her treatment group, leaving only the 2 of them in the little apartment with its old dining table beside the window. Tessa lifted the first spoonful of soup to her mouth and immediately went still. Her eyes widened. Then a sound Ronan hadn't heard from her in all their 2 years together burst free, a peal of bright, helpless laughter. Still laughing, she reached for her glass of water and asked between broken breaths how much salt he had put in the pot. Because this wasn't soup, it was an entire ocean. Ronan tasted a spoonful, grimaced, and for the first time, Tessa saw the ears of Chicago's most feared crime boss turn red. He stubbornly declared that recipes on the internet couldn't be trusted, and she laughed again, the sound warming the tiny kitchen as though sunlight had filled it. But she ate the soup anyway, slowly, one spoonful at a time, finishing the unbearably salty bowl without leaving a single drop. When he asked why, she set down her spoon, looked through the dark window, and said it had been a very long time since anyone had cooked for her. The last person had been her mother, on the night before everything fell apart. The kitchen grew silent, and within that stillness, like an old door opening by itself after years of being locked, Tessa began to tell her story, her voice even and distant, as though she were reading aloud from a page she had long ago committed to memory. She told him about the year she was 16, about the evening her parents drove out of state to attend a relative's wedding, about the telephone ringing at midnight, and the police officer's voice telling her there had been an accident on the highway. She told him how she sat beside the telephone until morning, unable to cry because in the next room, her little sister was burning with fever, and she suddenly understood that from that moment onward, she was everything the child had left in the world. She told him about the nursing scholarship letter that was still lying somewhere at the bottom of a closet, about her dream of wearing a white uniform and caring for the sick, a dream she had folded neatly away like a dress she would never wear, because tuition and Piper's medicine couldn't exist in the same wallet. She told him, almost in passing, as though mentioning an old scar, about a man named Kyle, whose ring she had once worn, a man who had stayed beside her for 3 years and made every kind of promise, then vanished one morning with all the money the sisters had saved in their joint account. He left no letter and no farewell, only the ring on the table like an unwanted purchase being returned. And she told him about the thin letter from the transplant board the year before, a letter she had read so many times that she knew every comma by heart, in which they had written in the sterile language of courtesy that Piper's case couldn't move forward, not because the young woman wasn't sick enough, but because Tessa, as her guardian, couldn't provide sufficient proof of financial resources to guarantee the treatment she would need after surgery. She recounted all of it with dry eyes, without shedding a single tear. And when Ronan asked very softly how she could remain so calm, she turned toward him and smiled, a smile that hurt his chest more deeply than any sob could have. I ran out of tears a long time ago, Ronan. Crying is a luxury for people who still have time. All I have left are the things that must be done. Ronan sat there with one hand resting on the table, only a hand's breadth from hers. And for the first time in his life, he wanted to tell another human being about himself, about the mother who had waited tables in a noodle shop, about the night that taught him to believe the heart was a fatal weakness, about the things no one in the world had ever heard. But the words halted in his throat like soldiers who didn't dare cross a battlefield trench, and all he could do was rise in silence and serve her another bowl of unbearably salty soup. Their first date came on a Saturday afternoon, when Ronan called and asked whether she would have dinner with him, not as an employer inviting his secretary, but as a man inviting a woman. And after a silence long enough for his heart to miss several beats, Tessa said yes. She had imagined that he would take her to some rooftop restaurant where the wine cost more than an entire month of her salary, but the car turned onto a narrow street in a working-class neighborhood on the south side and stopped before an old Italian restaurant with a faded wooden sign bearing the name Rosaria, its windows clouded with steam, and its tables covered in red and white checkered cloths worn at the corners. The elderly owner welcomed Ronan with the embrace of family reunited after many years apart, then led them to a table in the corner beside the window. When the steaming plates of pasta arrived, Tessa noticed that Ronan kept looking toward a small table near the register, his eyes resting there while seeming to gaze through the passage of many years. Then he began to speak, his voice low and slow, like a man touching for the first time a wound that had been closed for far too long. He told her that the restaurant was named Rosaria, after the owner's grandmother, and that his mother had once waited tables in that very room throughout her youth. The little table near the register was where she used to sit and rest her feet after every shift, a poor waitress with a smile that, according to the elderly people in the neighborhood, could brighten the entire street. Then his father had walked into the restaurant one winter day, the heir to the Gallagher family, and carried her into his world, a world of locked rooms and questions no one was permitted to ask. He told Tessa that his mother had never belonged in that world. She had withered amid velvet and luxury, and when her heart began to fail, she hid it from everyone. She concealed the pain and the pills because weakness wasn't allowed to exist in the Gallagher household, and she didn't want to become a burden or a source of trouble to anyone. By the time everyone discovered the truth, it was already too late. She died on an autumn morning when he was still a teenager, and the last thing she left him was the simple silver ring she had worn since her days working at the restaurant, the only object she had kept from her former life. Tessa sat motionless, scarcely daring to breathe, and Ronan continued, telling her about the second wound, about the young woman he had loved when he was barely in his 20s, the innocent first love of a sheltered heir to a criminal family who had believed he might still live like an ordinary man. His father's enemies found her and turned her into a piece on the chessboard of powerful men. Although no one was physically harmed in the end, fear did the rest. She left him in tears, saying she didn't possess the courage to live a life in which she would always have to look over her shoulder. From that day forward, he carried a poisonous conviction inside him, like a curse, that loving someone meant painting a target on that person's back, and therefore the only way to protect those he cared about was never to allow himself to love anyone. He lifted his eyes to hers, and those gray depths were naked now, with no layer of ice left to hide behind. He told her that he had lived by that curse for years, until the day she collapsed in front of his desk, and he realized a truth that had kept him from sleeping. She had been fading in exactly the same way his mother had died, quietly and silently, carrying every burden alone so she wouldn't trouble anyone, and he wasn't strong enough to watch it happen a second time in his life. He said he wasn't good with beautiful words. All his life, he had learned only how to give orders, and had never learned how to plead. But that night, he wanted to tell her that he loved her, and perhaps he had loved her long before that night at the hospital. He had loved her from the stomach pills she placed beside his cup of tea, from the way she walked through a room filled with dangerous men without the slightest trace of fear, and the words she had whispered while unconscious. He wanted to answer them now, while they were both awake, by telling her that he felt the same. The tears Tessa had believed were gone forever quietly filled her eyes, but she didn't allow them to fall. She looked at the man before her for a long time, then said that she would say yes, but on one condition, and he had to swear by everything he possessed. He asked what the condition was. She placed her hand over his, looked directly into his eyes, and spoke each word clearly, as though carving it into stone. Never make a decision for me and call it love, even if you believe it's for my own good, even if you're trying to protect me. Can you promise me that? And Ronan Gallagher, the man who had never bowed his head before anyone, closed his hand around hers and said, I promise. The good news came one afternoon at the beginning of the month, when Ronan stepped out of the conference room and found Tessa waiting in the corridor on the 40th floor, clutching a sheet of paper tightly against her chest with both hands. Upon her face was an expression he had never seen in all their 2 years together, the trembling light of someone who had finally glimpsed a door opening after standing before walls for many years. She pulled him into his office, closed the door, and spoke in a voice strained by the effort to contain her emotions. A hospital in Rochester had sent a letter. Piper had passed the medical evaluation for an experimental kidney transplant program. Her case had been placed in a priority group, and only one final stage remained, an assessment of her guardian's financial ability to guarantee the care she would need after surgery. Tessa stopped there, and Ronan understood why. This was the very door that had once slammed shut in her face, the rejection letter whose every comma she knew by heart, and now fate was forcing her to walk the same road that had already broken her once before. But this time, something was different. She lifted her eyes to his and said that she had managed to save some money over the years. It wasn't much, but it belonged to her. This program offered better assistance to families with low incomes, and she believed, for the first time in many years, she was allowing herself to believe that she and Piper might pass this final stage on their own 2 feet. Then she drew a deep breath, like someone preparing to plunge into the water, and told him the rest. The program required the patient's family to relocate to Rochester for at least 1 year, so the medical team could closely monitor the treatment. She had spent many nights thinking about it, and she had done something she had never dared to do before. She had applied to return to nursing school at a college there, through an evening program designed for people who worked while studying, and if everything went well, she and Piper would leave Chicago within a month. The room fell silent for a moment, and within that stillness, Tessa suddenly smiled, a bewildered smile Ronan had never seen on this normally composed woman. She told him that since she was 18 years old, she had never dared to say this aloud to anyone, not even to herself in the mirror. She had believed the dream had died with the scholarship letter lying at the bottom of her closet, but it turned out that it had only been sleeping. It had remained there all these years. Then she told him, her voice trembling like someone asking the entire world for permission to hope, that she still often dreamed of herself wearing a white nursing uniform, walking down a sunlit hospital corridor with a chart bearing a patient's name in her hands. In that dream, She wasn't running from anyone, and wasn't struggling beneath the weight of any burden. She was simply standing where she belonged, caring for others not because she had to, but because it was what her heart had chosen. By the time she finished, her eyes were red, and she gave an embarrassed laugh as she wiped their corners, saying that it was strange how speaking a dream aloud could be more difficult than talking about loss. Ronan walked toward her, gathered her into his arms, rested his chin upon her brown hair, and told her that he was happy for her, happy for Piper as well, and that she deserved this more than anyone he had ever known. He spoke those words with complete sincerity, and every one of them was true. Yet in that same moment, while his arms held the woman he loved, something cold and familiar began creeping into the chest of a man accustomed to controlling every outcome. A chain of uninvited questions rose within him. What if the financial assessment rejected her again, just as it had before? What if that door slammed shut once more and crushed her forever this time? Rochester was a full day's journey from Chicago. She would be there alone with her sick sister, beyond his sight, beyond his reach, beyond the protection he had built around her. Tessa looked up at him with eyes still shining with hope, and Ronan smiled at her, a gentle smile without the slightest ripple on its surface, while deep beneath it, where she couldn't see, uncertainty gnawed at him like seawater eroding the foundation of a levee, little by little, one grain at a time. But fate never seemed willing to let the Monroe sisters travel a smooth road for very long, and 2 weeks before they were scheduled to leave Chicago, on a night of drizzling rain, Ronan's phone rang shortly before midnight. Tessa was on the other end, her voice trembling and broken, telling him that Piper's condition had suddenly worsened, that her readings were deteriorating rapidly, and that an ambulance was on its way. Before she could even finish the sentence, Ronan had pulled on his coat and rushed out the door. He reached the hospital only minutes after the ambulance, and throughout the hours that followed, he sat beside Tessa in the intensive care waiting room, holding her icy hand, while the doctors worked behind closed doors, feeling every tremor pass from her shoulders into his whenever footsteps sounded in the corridor. Near dawn, a doctor emerged and announced that Piper's condition had temporarily stabilized. She was awake but still very weak, and only one person could visit her for a few minutes at a time. Tessa went in first, and when she returned with swollen red eyes, Ronan entered the dim room, illuminated only by the soft blue glow of the medical equipment. The 19-year-old girl seemed almost lost among the intravenous lines and monitoring screens, her small face as pale as the bedsheet beneath her. He intended only to stand there silently for a moment before leaving, but as he approached, Piper's thin fingers suddenly moved and reached blindly through the air, and by instinct, he placed his hand inside hers. Her eyes didn't fully open. She was drifting through the hazy place between consciousness and sleep, lost in medication and exhaustion, and in a whisper as faint as breath, she called him doctor. Ronan was about to correct her, but the words that followed rooted him to the floor. Doctor, may I ask you for just one thing? If I don't make it, please don't let my sister know how tired I was. Tell her I went peacefully, as if I were only falling asleep, because my sister has never lived a single day for herself. Ever since our parents died, she has carried me on her back, without once saying I was heavy. Every time someone gives her something, life makes her pay twice the price. So I only wish, just once, that I could see my sister loved by someone without having to pay for it with anything at all. When she finished, the girl's breathing softened, her fingers slowly loosened, and she sank into a deep and peaceful sleep, leaving the man standing motionless beside the hospital bed, with her words burning inside his chest. Ronan remained there for a long time, gazing at the sleeping face of the young woman who had used the last of her strength after a night balanced between life and death, not to ask for anything for herself, but to plead for her sister. Then he gently withdrew his hand, pulled the blanket a little higher over her, and stepped out of the room. The hospital corridor at dawn was as silent as an abandoned church. Tessa had fallen asleep from exhaustion across the waiting room chairs with his coat draped over her, and Ronan stood alone in that corridor as his hands slowly tightened into fists. Inside his mind, fragments from all the days and months before began fitting themselves together. Piper's whisper about a sister who had never been allowed to live for herself, the image of the empty food envelopes inside the shoebox, the trembling hope in Tessa's eyes when she dared to speak her dream aloud for the first time, and the financial assessment still waiting before her. The same door that had already broken her once. A decision began to take shape within him, growing stronger with every flicker of the fluorescent lights overhead. A decision born from the truest love he possessed, yet following the only path this man had ever known how to walk. He told himself that she had already paid enough for an entire lifetime, that he wouldn't stand by and watch fate demand another cent from her, that if life was a chessboard filled with obstacles blocking her path, then he, Ronan Gallagher, would quietly lift each one from the board, one at a time, so cleanly and gently that she would never know they had existed. Somewhere far away in the depths of his mind, a small voice tried to remind him of a promise made beneath the golden lights of Rosaria, but the footsteps of his resolve trampled over it, like someone stepping across a warning sign in the darkness, before having time to read the words written upon it. Over the next 2 weeks, while Tessa busied herself preparing for the journey with eyes that shone more brightly each day with hope, Ronan quietly played a game of his own behind the locked doors of the 40th floor, making 3 consecutive moves with the same precision and silence that had marked every operation of his life. For his first move, he had his people contact every hospital where the sisters still owed medical bills, purchase through an intermediary company the entire burden of debt that could have broken a human life, then ordered every dollar erased. One day, when Tessa called to ask about the remaining balance, she would simply be told that her account had been settled through an assistance program. There would be no donor's name, no trail, nothing to suggest that fate had done anything more than suddenly become kind. His second move caused even Quinn to frown when he received the order. Ronan wanted them to find the man named Kyle, the one who had disappeared years earlier with all the money the sisters had saved, and he wanted the man to return every cent. The Gallagher men found Kyle without much difficulty. He was living on the outskirts of the city, burdened by gambling debts and surviving through petty, questionable work. One evening, 2 courteous men dressed in dark clothing joined him at a table in a quiet bar. No one raised his voice, and no one laid a hand on anyone. There were only a few gentle observations about how certain debts in life needed to be paid before the interest began compounding. And several days later, a transfer appeared in Tessa's account for the exact amount that had been stolen years before, accompanied by a brief apology written in letters that trembled like the hand of the man who had typed them. The third move was the largest, and it was made immediately before Piper's financial assessment. Ronan established a brand new charitable foundation through legal documents that couldn't be traced back to him, and the foundation sent a grant to the experimental transplant program at the Rochester Hospital, a figure so large that the entire hospital board fell silent for several moments when they saw it on paper. It came with only one request: that resources be given priority to families whose guardians had low incomes. Ronan allowed himself only one personal touch in the entire game, a silent signature he believed no one would ever decipher. He named the foundation Rosaria. When everything was complete, Ronan sat alone in his office and imagined the day he would tell Tessa the whole truth. After Piper was safely on the operating table, after every door had opened, he would present the entire game to her as a gift wrapped in 2 weeks of sleepless nights, and she would understand that he had done it all because he loved her. Only Quinn, the one person who knew about all 3 moves, didn't congratulate him. The older man stood beside the window looking down upon the city in the fading afternoon light, remained silent for a long while, then spoke in the deep voice of someone who had served 2 generations of the Gallagher family. "Mr. Gallagher, I watched you grow up, so I know you're doing all of this with your whole heart. But that's exactly why I have to say it. You're building a golden cage. You're covering every bar with genuine love. But a golden cage is still a cage, and that woman has spent her entire life longing for the chance to open the door and step outside with a key of her own." Ronan listened, gave a slight nod as though he had understood, then replied that when Piper was well again, Quinn would see that all of it had been worthwhile. Quinn said nothing more. When he left, he merely closed the door more gently than usual. That same evening, on the other side of the city, in a dark corner of an old bar, the man who had just been forced to surrender his last dollar to repay a debt from long ago sat motionless before a glass of liquor that was still half full. Kyle set the glass down on the scarred wooden table, his eyes darkening as the fragments of information he had gathered over the past several days began fitting together into a name that made the entire city lower its voice. The man standing behind the woman he had once deceived was the Gallagher crime boss. Kyle remained seated for a long while, his fingers tapping slowly against the tabletop. Then a thin, cold smile gradually formed at the corner of his mouth. He took out his phone, searched for an old contact number he hadn't called in years, raised the phone to his ear, and waited for it to ring. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, Lying among the travel documents Tessa was arranging on the dining table of the small apartment. It came from the Rochester hospital, printed on formal paper bearing the heading of the experimental transplant program, and she opened it with the racing heart of someone waiting for news about the final assessment. But this wasn't an assessment letter. It was a notice sent to the families participating in the program, in which the hospital respectfully thanked the benefactors who had supported its fund for families with low incomes. In the middle of the page, printed in solemn italics, was the name of the largest donor, which had just given the program an unprecedented contribution, the Rosaria Foundation. Tessa stopped when she reached those words. The name meant nothing to the rest of the world, nothing to the hospital board, nothing to anyone else who had ever held that piece of paper. But to her, it was the golden light of an old Italian restaurant, the little table beside the register, and the deep voice of a man telling her about his mother on the night he entrusted her with a secret he said no one else in the world had ever heard. Her hand began to tremble. She sat down, read the name again, then once more, and suddenly, the fragments of the past several weeks came rushing together to form a picture that turned her cold. There was the call from the old hospital informing her that all the sisters' medical bills had been settled through an assistance program, whose name she had searched for but never found. There was the money stolen years ago, which had suddenly returned to her account with a trembling apology from the man who had vanished without a trace. Everything she had called a miracle, everything for which she had lit candles and silently thanked fate, had been arranged by the same hand. That afternoon, Tessa went straight to the 40th floor and entered Ronan's office without knocking, as she had done for the past 2 years. But this time, she carried neither a stomach pill nor a smile. She placed the letter on the wooden desk directly before him and asked in a voice so calm that it was frightening whether he wanted to tell her himself or whether she should read the name aloud. Ronan looked at the paper, and for one moment, she saw the thing she feared most. Not denial, but the eyes of a man who believed he had done what was right. He rose and told her that he had intended to explain everything after Piper's surgery, that everything he had done was meant only to clear the stones from her path. That debt should never have been allowed to weigh upon her shoulders. That man should have repaid her long ago. The money was only a drop of water to him, but it could be an entire ocean to Piper's program. She could be angry with him, but she couldn't deny that all of it was for her own good. Tessa listened without interrupting, and only when he had finished did she speak, each word falling slowly and clearly, like drops of melting ice. You still don't understand. Even now, at this very moment, you still don't understand. I'm not angry because you have money. I'm angry because that night at the restaurant, I asked you for one thing. Only one thing. And you promised me. Yet less than a month later, you broke that promise so neatly that it didn't make a sound. She picked up the letter, and her voice began to fracture at its most fragile edges. Do you know what hurts the most? All my life, I've fallen and gotten back up by myself. I've fallen, then risen again. That was the only thing I had that no one could take from me, but you didn't buy my debt, Ronan. You bought away my right to stand up on my own. The tears she had once said were long gone now streamed down her cheeks. But she didn't wipe them away. She looked directly at him and delivered the final thrust, one that wounded her as deeply as it wounded him. And then there's Piper. She fought for her place on that list through every dialysis session and every needle. But from this day forward, I'll never know whether my sister was chosen because she deserved it, or because of a crime boss's money. You took that answer away from both of us forever. Ronan stood as still as a stone statue, every language of power he possessed dying inside that room. Tessa wiped her face with the back of her hand, drew a long breath, then removed the office keys from her purse and gently placed them on the desk beside the letter. With her composure restored, she said that she was resigning effective that day, that her formal resignation would be submitted to Human Resources according to proper procedure, and that she thanked him for the past 2 years. Then she turned and walked away. Ronan remained where he was, watching the woman who had entered this room without knocking for 2 years now leave it. And for the first time since they had known each other, she stopped at the threshold, reached behind her, and closed his office door from the outside. The soft click of the latch sounded like a gunshot in the empty room. 3 days after the office door had closed from the outside, Ronan still hadn't grown accustomed to the new silence on the 40th floor, a silence without the familiar sound of light footsteps in the corridor, without the stomach pill placed beside his cup of tea each morning, and he caught himself looking toward that door many times throughout the day, like a man staring at a clock that had stopped. It was on one such afternoon that Eamon Walsh requested a private meeting. The financial advisor who had served the Gallagher family since Ronan's father's time entered with his usual composure, his silver hair neatly combed and his gray suit without a single crease, but instead of the familiar stacks of reports, he placed a brown envelope on the wooden desk, then settled into the chair opposite Ronan, with the ease of a man who had already calculated every move. Ronan opened the envelope, and the blood in his veins turned to ice. Inside were photographs taken from a distance. Tessa was helping Piper out of the dialysis center. Tessa was waiting for a car beneath an awning. Piper, wearing her familiar wool scarf, was smiling as she said something to her sister. Ordinary moments of daily life had been imprisoned through a cold camera lens, and every image was sharp enough to prove that the photographer had been standing very close, far closer than the safe distance Ronan had believed he had created around the sisters. Eamon began to speak, his voice still as calm as if he were presenting a balance sheet. He said that Mr. Gallagher had surely noticed a few discrepancies in the organization's accounts recently, that his internal audit team was drawing dangerously close to names that shouldn't be uncovered, and that Eamon had come that day only to propose a silence that would benefit them both. Ronan would end the audit and sign over control of the Southern Harbor to the group of companies Eamon represented. In return, those photographs would remain nothing more than photographs, because accidents happened every day in the city. To anyone, even to people who had nothing to do with their world. Ronan sat motionless, but inside his chest, the old nightmare was returning in every terrible detail. He saw the tear-soaked face of the young woman from years before, and remembered the curse he had carved into his own bones beneath the lights of the Italian restaurant, that loving someone meant painting a target on that person's back. Now fate was holding those photographs before his face, as if to prove that the curse had never been wrong. He heard his own voice, so low and cold that Eamon's expression shifted for an instant, telling the man to leave because he needed time to consider the offer. The moment the door closed, Ronan's old instincts roared like an animal driven into a corner, showing him only two familiar paths. He could disappear from Tessa's life forever, severing every connection so the target on her back would gradually fade. Or he could deal with Eamon Walsh the way the underworld had always dealt with traitors, swiftly, cleanly, and without leaving a witness. He had already picked up the phone and entered nearly all of a number reserved for orders that were never recorded when Quinn walked in without waiting to be invited. As though the older man had been standing behind the door from the beginning and knew the exact moment he needed to appear. He looked at the phone in Ronan's hand, then at the photographs scattered across the desk, and spoke in the voice of the only person in the world who still dared say such things to him. "Mr. Gallagher, put down the phone and listen to me this once. I stood beside your father on the night he chose the path you're about to choose. Your father chose war against his enemies, and war against the people who loved him. In the end, he won every battle, only to die alone in a vast house where no one dared knock on his door. Do you intend to become exactly like him, all the way to the grave?" The phone lowered little by little. Ronan stood beside the window in silence for a long time, looking down upon the city as its lights came alive, knowing that somewhere within it stood the sisters' small apartment with its warm golden windows. That night, he chose neither of the two paths his instincts had offered him, but fear wouldn't allow him to remain still. He ordered the protection around Tessa and Piper tightened to the highest level, adding more men and more shifts, monitoring every route, and requiring that all of their movements and schedules be reported and coordinated through the one member of his security detail he trusted most, the man who had devotedly held an umbrella over the sisters through all those rainy days, Boyd. 1 week after Tessa left, the Human Resources Department asked what should be done with the belongings that remained at her old desk, and Ronan said he would handle them himself, an answer that surprised everyone on the 40th floor, though no one dared ask another question. That evening, after everyone had left the building, he sat down in her chair, opened each drawer, and placed every small possession into a paper box, the pen whose end she used to bite gently whenever she was thinking, the partly used packet of chamomile tea, and in the final drawer, beneath a stack of notepaper, his hand touched a cloth-bound blue notebook with a worn spine. He opened it, intending to determine whether it was a work record or a private journal, so he could decide whether it should be returned, and then he couldn't close it again. It wasn't a work notebook. It was a collection of letters, hundreds of handwritten letters that had never been sent, one written every week without fail for 2 full years. Each began with some hesitant form of address she had never dared speak aloud, and every one of them was about him, He read the first letter, written during her earliest days at the company. My new boss is every bit as frightening as the rumors say. I haven't seen him smile once all week. But today, I discovered that he asked the kitchen to prepare a separate meal of soft food for the elderly security guard who just had his teeth replaced. What a difficult man to understand. Ronan kept reading, letter after letter, and 2 years of his life returned through the eyes of the woman who had stood 15 feet away from him every day. There were letters about meetings in which he had shouted at an entire room, then quietly remained behind to arrange payment for the gatekeeper's daughter's hospital bills. A letter written not long afterward added that the little girl had completely recovered and now spent every afternoon running happily through the building lobby while waiting for her father to finish work. Whenever I see that, I think that no one in this city truly knows who this man is. Some letters forced him to stop for a very long time. There was the one she had written after he stood in the rain without an umbrella at the funeral of an elderly employee. There was another about his eyes on the afternoons when he stood alone beside the window. How can someone possess so much wealth and power, yet always seem to be standing behind a pane of glass, watching life unfold without daring to step into it? Then he reached the final letter, written on the day she placed her keys on his desk. Her handwriting was still round and careful, but the lines were much shorter than usual. I'm leaving soon. Perhaps it's better this way. Even when two hearts find each other, love cannot survive where trust is bought instead of given. Even dreaming feels like borrowing, and I already owe life enough. Ronan sat in the empty room with the notebook open in his hands until dawn, and when the first rays of sunlight touched the desk, something inside him had changed forever. Those hundreds of letters revealed a truth that all his power had failed to see. This woman had loved him by seeing him, by truly seeing him, while he had answered that love by covering her eyes to everything that belonged to him. If he still wanted to be worthy of even one line in that notebook, he would have to do the opposite of everything the Gallagher family had ever taught him. That afternoon, he appeared at the door of the sisters' small apartment, with no flowers and no gift, carrying only a brown envelope. When Tessa opened the door with guarded eyes, he told her that he hadn't come to ask her to return. He had come to do what he should have done from the beginning, to let her see all of him, including the darkest part, and then allow her to decide for herself. He sat down at the old dining table where the bowl of unbearably salty soup had once rested, and for the first time in his life, he told her everything, without concealing a single detail. He told her about the organization and what it truly was, about Eamon Walsh and the suspicious money, about the brown envelope containing photographs of the sisters, and about the danger now hanging over her head simply because she had been loved by a man like him. Tessa listened to everything, her face growing paler as the photographs were spread across the table, but she didn't run away or burst into tears. She merely sat there for a long time. Then Ronan did the final and most difficult thing. He looked into her eyes and asked a question he had never asked anyone throughout a lifetime spent ruling over others. "What do you want me to do?" The little kitchen fell silent, and Tessa looked at the most powerful man in the city sitting before her as he waited for an instruction. Then she answered in a voice that was very soft, yet as steady as stone. "I want no one to be afraid anymore. Not me, not Piper, and not even you. You've been afraid your entire life, Ronan. Can't you see that?" Her answer opened a road that no one in the Gallagher family had ever dared to walk. And in the days that followed, inside the offices of a discreet law firm, Ronan sat with attorneys and representatives of the federal authorities and placed every piece of evidence against Eamon's network on the table. In exchange, he secured a historic agreement, dissolved every operation that existed in the shadows, and began the journey of bringing all of Gallagher Holdings into the light. The audit, conducted in cooperation with attorneys and federal investigators, began the following week inside a discreet office, where sealed boxes of documents arrived every day, and Ronan sat there from morning until late at night, personally examining every page of the accounts Eamon Walsh had controlled through 2 generations of the Gallagher family. The silver-haired man proved to be an artist with numbers, siphoning money through dozens of subsidiaries nested inside one another, like boxes hidden within boxes. But every craftsman eventually leaves behind the marks of his tools. One evening, the lead attorney knocked on Ronan's door, carrying an old personnel file from a transportation subsidiary that had been dissolved many years earlier. She said they had found something unusual. The company's entire archive remained intact. Every employee, every payroll sheet, every report, except for one period of time and one name that had been completely erased. The removal had been so thorough that only someone with the highest authority over the organization's records could have done it. Yet no erasure was perfect. The person's name still appeared in an old backup copy of a compensation record whose existence even Eamon had probably forgotten. She placed the faded printout before Ronan, and he stared at the name written upon it. A name he already knew. The name of the man he had once ordered his people to find and forced to repay Tessa, Kyle. For 1 second, Ronan thought it was only a coincidence. But then the investigators spread more documents across the table. And piece by piece, an old picture began to emerge, sending a deeper chill along his spine with every page. Kyle had once worked in the records department of that transportation company, which had operated under Eamon's direct control, during the same years in which a large financial loss had occurred. The internal investigation at the time had concluded that a low-ranking employee had committed fraud and had been quietly dismissed, and the matter had been handled so discreetly that it never reached the Gallagher family. But numbers didn't lie when placed beside one another. The missing money from those years had followed the same pattern, bore the same craftsman's touch, and moved through the same methods as the money Eamon was accused of stealing now. That meant the earlier fraud hadn't been committed by one insignificant employee. It had been a joint operation between two men, and when Eamon needed a sacrifice to close the case, he had thrown Kyle aside, erased every trace of him from the system, and used the secret both to silence him and to hold power over him for the rest of his life. Ronan sat motionless before the papers, and then the most terrifying question rose unbidden in his mind. If Kyle had been expelled from the organization all those years ago, why had he appeared shortly afterward in the life of a young orphan who was working 2 jobs to support her sister, remained beside her for 3 years, placed a ring on her finger, then vanished at the very moment she was most exhausted and vulnerable? Ronan ordered his people to reconstruct the entire timeline and compare every date, and the answer that emerged was so brutal that he had to rise and walk to the window to breathe. Kyle had begun approaching Tessa at precisely the same time her application entered the recruitment process for the senior secretary position at Gallagher Holdings, the position that would place her 16 feet from Ronan every day, listening to every appointment and touching every file. That young woman hadn't been loved by chance. She had been selected, marked in advance like a piece on a chessboard. Kyle had been sent to take hold of her, so that if she ever reached the 40th floor, Eamon would already have a pair of ears lying beside her at night. When Tessa failed the recruitment process that year, because her qualifications weren't sufficient, the piece lost its value. Kyle withdrew and casually stole every dollar the sisters had saved, as compensation for the effort he had spent pretending to love her. Then, in a cruel turn of fate, she applied again exactly 1 year later, and earned the position through her own ability, never knowing that she was stepping onto the same old chessboard. Ronan stood beside the window looking down upon the city, both hands braced against the cold stone ledge, and understood something that hurt his chest more deeply than anything else. The tragedies she had described that night over the bowl of unbearably salty soup, the man who vanished and the savings that disappeared with him, hadn't been simple misfortune. None of the suffering in her life had happened by chance. His world of shadows had reached into her life and crushed her once before he had even known the name Tessa Monroe. As he stood there, an instinct sharpened by years of survival trembled inside him like a slack violin string. Eamon was a man who never played only one move. The photographs inside the brown envelope had been taken from such a close distance, and with such clarity, that the old man had to be hiding another knife inside his sleeve, a knife already waiting somewhere nearby. Ronan simply couldn't yet imagine just how close it truly was. The day of their departure from Chicago finally arrived beneath a clear morning sky, and Ronan had arranged every detail down to the minute. Although he and Tessa still exchanged only the brief words that were necessary, and she continued to keep the distance of someone learning how to trust again from the beginning, she had agreed to let his security team escort the sisters to the train station, because this was a particularly important day. Piper had one final dialysis appointment in Chicago at noon, and immediately afterward, the sisters would board an afternoon train so they could arrive for admission at the new center in Rochester the following morning. The doctors had carefully calculated the schedule, so Piper's body wouldn't have to wait too long between dialysis treatments. The car collected the sisters from their small apartment precisely on time, with their luggage neatly arranged in the trunk. Piper sat in the back seat, hugging her familiar pillow and talking endlessly about the new city, while Tessa looked through the window for one final glimpse of the street that had witnessed the whole of her youth. Then, as the car passed through the district of old warehouses near the harbor, a light truck slowly crossed the road and blocked their path, while another vehicle quietly closed in behind them. There was no screeching of brakes, no collision, and not a gun or knife in sight. only several courteous men appearing beside the car doors. Before the Gallagher driver could react, he recognized the face outside his window, signaling for him to lower the glass as someone from his own team. At that same moment, through the listening device installed in the vehicle, Ronan heard the gentle voice that had once bought Piper warm milk and sheltered the sisters beneath an umbrella on rainy days calmly say, "Please step out of the car, ladies. Don't be afraid. No one is going to touch you." In that single sentence, Ronan's entire world collapsed. The informant was Boyd. Everything that followed unfolded as smoothly as a play rehearsed many times. The sisters were transferred to another vehicle and taken inside a clean old warehouse furnished with a table and chairs. No one raised his voice, and neither woman was restrained. Piper was even given a bottle of water. Only when the warehouse door closed did the man waiting beside the table turn to face them, and the blood drained from Tessa's face when she recognized the man whose ring she had once worn, Kyle. At the same time, on the 40th floor, Ronan held the phone with his knuckles turned white as Kyle's slow, self-satisfied voice came through the speaker. He told Ronan not to waste time tracing the vehicle, and not to blame his own men. Boyd had belonged to Eamon long before he joined the Gallagher organization. Every route, every habit, and every detail of the sisters' schedules over the past several weeks had been delivered directly into their hands by Ronan's own security system. Kyle gave a quiet laugh, then added the words that made Ronan's grip tighten on the phone until his hand trembled. "You see, the more closely you protect them, the more clearly we can see them." The fear Ronan had carried throughout his life, the curse he had carved into himself beneath the lights of the Italian restaurant, had now come true in the cruelest way imaginable. The target on the back of the woman he loved hadn't been painted by his enemies. His own protective hand had darkened it day after day. Kyle continued, his voice turning cold, and said that their demand was simple and beneficial to everyone. Ronan would bring the documents transferring control of the southern harbor, already prepared according to the template they had sent him, and come to the warehouse alone, unarmed, and without anyone following him. Once he signed, the sisters would board their train as though nothing had happened. If he delayed or attempted any trick, Kyle wouldn't need to do anything at all. He would only have to sit still, because this was Piper's dialysis day, and she had already missed her noon appointment. Her body didn't know how to negotiate. With every passing hour, everything that needed to be filtered from her blood would continue accumulating in silence. No one inside the warehouse would lay a finger on the girl, but time was touching her with every passing minute, so Ronan should look at the clock and choose his speed accordingly. The call ended. Ronan stood in the middle of his office, and for one moment, the entire room seemed to tilt around him. He saw Piper's pale face as she had lain in the hospital that night, and heard again her whispered plea that her sister might be loved without having to pay a price. He saw Tessa sitting in some cold warehouse with her younger sister in her arms, while life once again forced her to pay for being loved. He closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds, and when he opened them, the storm in his gray eyes had frozen into the most terrifying stillness Quinn had ever seen in him. He summoned the older man and gave his orders in a few brief words. Prepare the car. Call the attorney and the federal agents. As for Ronan, he would do exactly what they wanted. He would go there alone. The black car stopped before the old warehouse near the harbor, as the afternoon sunlight turned the color of honey, and Ronan stepped out alone exactly as instructed, unarmed and without anyone following him, carrying only the transfer documents beneath one arm and wearing a coat button that looked no different from any other button in the world. Quinn had fastened it to his coat with his own hands 1 hour earlier, warning him that from that moment onward, every sound around him would travel directly to the federal agents waiting throughout the harbor district. Ronan's task was to make them talk, and to make them say as much as possible. The warehouse door opened just wide enough to let him enter, and beneath the pools of light cast by the lamps hanging high above, he saw everything at once. Kyle sat behind a metal table with his legs crossed, and the smile of a man who believed he had already won. Boyd stood with his arms folded in a shadowed corner, unable to look Ronan directly in the eye. Several other men were scattered around the warehouse, and at the far end, on a bench beside the wall, Tessa sat holding Piper tightly in her arms. The girl's familiar pillow had fallen beside her feet, and her face was growing paler with every hour of dialysis she had missed. Ronan's eyes met Tessa's across the vast warehouse, and he gave her the slightest nod, a signal only the two of them understood. "Trust me one more time." Kyle applauded slowly, welcomed the crime boss for arriving on time, then pushed the papers across the table and told him to sign so everyone could go home. But Ronan didn't pick up the pen. He pulled out a chair and sat down with the unhurried ease of a man inside his own conference room, saying that before he gave away a signature this expensive, he had the right to know whom he was paying. Then, with a carefully measured hint of contempt in his calm voice, he pressed upon the most painful wound of a man who had spent his entire life serving others. "Tell me, how much is old Eamon paying you for this? Or is it the same as before? He eats the meat while you gnaw the bones, then leaves you to take the blame. Have you forgotten the transportation company? Who walked away with all the money, and who had his name erased, and was thrown into the street like a diseased dog?" Kyle's face darkened. His wounded pride drove him to his feet, and exactly as Ronan had calculated, he began to talk, desperate to prove that he wasn't anyone's puppet. In a voice filled with bitter triumph, he declared that this time was different. This time, he had created the plan. He was the one who had suggested using the Monroe sisters as leverage. He had personally ordered Boyd to shape every route they traveled. He even boasted about the past, about how the old man had sent him years ago to win the trust of the girl who might become Gallagher's future secretary, how he had pretended to be her lover for 3 years, solely to place a pair of listening ears beside the Gallagher family. Every word fell into the tiny button on Ronan's chest, as though disappearing into a bottomless black box. Then Kyle planted both hands on the table, leaned close to Ronan's face, and asked the question he believed would deliver the final blow. "I still can't understand you, Ronan Gallagher. Are you really going to trade an entire empire for some secretary?" The whole warehouse fell silent. Ronan raised his eyes and looked directly into Kyle's, answering with such calm that every word carried the weight of stone. "I can build another empire, but the person who taught me how to be human is someone I'll meet only once in my life." In the moment after those words, something ancient and dark rose inside Ronan's chest as he looked at the smug smile of the man who had twice destroyed Tessa's youth. He knew that if he merely cleared his throat in a certain way, the men loyal to the Gallagher family and scattered outside were numerous enough to make Kyle disappear from the world without a trace. His hand slowly tightened into a fist upon the table, blue veins rising beneath the skin, while the monster, nourished by 3 generations of darkness, waited for a single nod. But then, beyond Kyle's shoulder, Ronan's gaze found the scene at the far end of the warehouse. Tessa was holding her sister tightly, one hand stroking the girl's hair in a slow rhythm as though soothing her to sleep, and all the hundreds of letters from the blue notebook returned to him at once. That woman had loved a Ronan whom even he had never met, and he wouldn't force her to love a killer. Before them all, his fist slowly opened and relaxed, settling flat upon the table. He said only one thing to Kyle. "You've just said everything that needed to be said." Before Kyle could understand, every warehouse door burst open at once, and federal agents poured in from all directions with arrest warrants in their hands. There wasn't a single gunshot or a drop of blood, only the sound of handcuffs closing around the wrists of Kyle and Boyd, while their rights were read aloud in steady voices throughout the warehouse. Ronan pushed through everyone and ran to the sisters, and the ambulance waiting outside carried Piper directly to the dialysis center before she crossed the threshold of danger. Once she was safely settled on the stretcher and color had begun returning to her face, the girl still found enough strength to open her eyes, look at the breathless man running beside her, and offer a weak, teasing smile. "Future brother-in-law, if you'd arrived any later, I really wouldn't have spoken to you again." At the same moment, the warehouse doors burst open beside the harbor. Federal agents on the other side of the city entered Eamon Walsh's office with arrest and search warrants in their hands. Ronan and the federal authorities had carefully arranged for both sides of the trap to close within the same hour, so no one would have time to warn anyone else. People later said that as the silver-haired advisor was escorted through the lobby, he maintained the composure of a model accountant, but the hand carrying his leather briefcase trembled faintly, because he understood better than anyone that the evidence inside those sealed boxes of documents was enough to ensure that he would never see the Southern Harbor again. The weeks that followed became a period the entire business community of Chicago could scarcely speak about without falling silent, because Ronan Gallagher honored every part of his agreement with the federal authorities in a way no one had believed possible. He dismantled, one by one, every operation in the shadows that 3 generations of the Gallagher family had spent their lives building. He surrendered every illegitimate business, accepted settlements and forfeitures that reduced his fortune by nearly half, and listened as those who had once feared him began calling him a madman behind his back, a man setting fire to his own throne. Some longtime members of the organization quietly walked away, and Ronan allowed them to go without stopping or blaming them. Only Quinn remained beside him through every signing, and one late afternoon, when the final dissolution document received its official seal, the older man asked whether he regretted it, an entire empire, an entire lifetime built by his father and grandfather. Ronan rose, put on his coat, and looked through the window as the lights of the city came alive. Then, in the gentle voice of a man who had finally set down a burden he had carried for far too long, he answered, "You know, this morning I walked from the parking garage to the building, and halfway there, I realized something. For the first time in my life, I was walking down the street without having to look over my shoulder. It turns out that feeling is worth more than everything I've just lost combined." Then the day of departure arrived, delayed only a few days from the original plan so Piper could fully recover from what had happened. This time, the central station platform was flooded with autumn sunlight. There were no vehicles blocking the road, and no hidden cameras watching them. Only 2 suitcases, one excited young woman reading aloud the names of every station the train would pass, and 2 adults standing opposite each other on the platform, with everything they had endured together resting silently between them. Ronan didn't ask Tessa to stay, though throughout the previous night, he had composed countless pleas in his mind, words such as, "Stay with me, and I'll take care of you for the rest of your life." But he had learned at the highest possible price that loving someone didn't mean drawing the road they were expected to follow. So he merely carried the sisters' luggage aboard the train, reminded Piper to keep her neck warm, then turned to Tessa, placed a round-trip ticket with the return date left blank into her hand, and said, "Go, finish your education and fulfill your dream of wearing that white uniform. Stay beside Piper until the very end of her journey. Chicago and I aren't going anywhere. Whenever you want to use the other half of this ticket, whether it's next year or 10 years from now, I'll still be here. And if you never use it, I'll still thank life for teaching me what it means to love someone the right way, even if I learned how so late." Tessa looked down at the ticket in her hand, then at the man who had dismantled an entire empire with his own hands, so that his answer to her would no longer bear a single stain of darkness. Her eyes filled with tears, but her lips curved into a smile. She rose onto her toes and pressed a gentle kiss to his lips in the middle of the windswept platform, a kiss that wasn't a farewell, but a promise that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The train whistle sounded, and she stepped aboard. Ronan stood there watching as the train slowly began to move, watching Piper's hand wave wildly behind the window, and Tessa standing behind her sister with the ticket pressed against her heart. The train grew smaller and finally disappeared beyond the curve, leaving him alone on the platform with a chest that felt as empty as a house after every loved one had gone, yet as proud as the heart of a soldier who had just done the most honorable thing of his life. In the months that followed, their love learned to live by a new rhythm, the rhythm of telephone calls at the same hour every evening, like a small private ritual. Tessa told him about her evening classes, the pages of textbooks she studied late into the night, and how well Piper was responding to the new treatment plan, while Ronan spoke about the long and difficult journey of transforming Gallagher Holdings into a legitimate company, about meetings with attorneys replacing gatherings in darkened rooms. Both of them came to recognize something strange, that separated by a full day's journey, they spoke to each other more openly, more honestly, and more deeply than they ever had during all the years they had stood only 16 feet apart. Every few weeks, Ronan flew to Rochester, and the man who had once set an entire hospital in motion with a single telephone call now sat for hours on the plastic chairs in the treatment center waiting room, like any ordinary family member, holding 2 cups of juice in his hands, memorizing the nurses' names, and standing in line to take a number. Once, an elderly woman sitting beside him even asked him to read an instruction sheet because the print was too small, and he patiently read every line aloud to her, never realizing that Tessa was standing in the corner of the room watching him with tears in her eyes. Then, one morning at the beginning of spring, a call came from the transplant program's review board, and the coordinator's voice trembled with joy as she announced that a miracle had happened. They had found a living donor who was a complete match for Piper. Every medical measurement exceeded the requirements, and the donor had completed all testing and psychological evaluations months earlier and had been waiting only for the board's approval. The only unusual detail was that the donor had requested anonymity until the surgery was officially scheduled. Tessa began crying in the middle of class when she received the news, while Ronan immediately booked the earliest flight. It was inside a conference room at the Rochester hospital, when the donor's file was opened before the family, according to procedure. that he and Tessa both fell silent at the sight of the portrait photograph, fastened to the corner of the page. The salt and pepper hair and calm eyes of the man who had walked beside the Gallagher family through 2 generations, Quinn Donnelly. He rose from the final row of seats, where he had been sitting quietly from the beginning, and before their stunned eyes, the older man slowly revealed a secret he had carried for nearly his entire life. Long ago, before he came to serve the Gallagher family, he had possessed a small family of his own and a daughter. The child had become gravely ill and hadn't survived. In those days, his family had been so poor that no matter how desperately they searched for help, they couldn't gather enough money to give her even a chance. He said only that much and offered no further details, but everyone in the room could hear the weight of decades resting beneath every word. Then he turned toward Ronan and said, "Mr. Gallagher, do you remember that night in the hospital corridor? The night I brought you the photograph of the shoebox? I stood there looking at Piper's medical records, looking at the empty food envelopes of a sister, struggling with everything she had to save her. And I saw the man I had been all those years ago. The only difference was that this time, God was giving me the opportunity I didn't have then. So the next morning, I quietly registered for testing without telling anyone, because I was afraid that if I spoke of it, and we weren't compatible, I would only be giving them false hope." He looked at Tessa as she covered her face and wept, then spoke the words that caused even the most experienced coordinators in the program to turn away and wipe their eyes. "Miss Tessa, I couldn't save my daughter. That's a debt I've carried my entire life and could never repay. So please allow me to save your sister. Let an old man do once what he was helpless to do all those years ago." The surgery was scheduled for the end of that month and proceeded even more smoothly than the doctors had expected. When the recovery room doors opened and the chief surgeon came out to announce that both donor and recipient were stable, that Piper's body had accepted the gift as though it had been born to belong to her, the corridor of the Rochester hospital witnessed a scene that made everyone passing by slow their steps. A young woman sobbed in the arms of a tall man whose own eyes were red, while both of them held tightly to the wrinkled hand of an older man who had just awakened after surgery. Quinn smiled weakly from the stretcher, and for the first time in decades, his steady eyes were clear and peaceful, as though he had finally set down an invisible burden that had weighed upon his shoulders for almost an entire lifetime. 1 year later, on a sunlit morning at the beginning of summer, the auditorium of the nursing school in Rochester echoed with applause as the name Tessa Monroe was announced, and the woman who had once folded away her dream like a dress she would never wear now walked onto the stage in her graduation gown, her eyes searching the audience for the 3 people who had risen to their feet and were applauding until their palms turned red. There was Piper, her face glowing with health and bearing no trace of the difficult years behind her. Quinn, smiling gently like a grandfather, and Ronan, the man who had flown to Rochester more times than anyone could count throughout the past year. Tessa returned to Chicago that very summer, not because anyone had asked her to stay, but because one of the city's major hospitals had hired her after reading the application of an honors graduate whose personal journey and years of devotion to caring for the sick set her apart. She returned for both her career and her love. No one had to sacrifice anything for anyone else, and that was precisely what made her homecoming complete. The Chicago, to which she returned, had changed as well. Gallagher Holdings was now a legitimate transportation and real estate company, with every trace of its past removed. And on the ground floor of the building stood a small office, whose lights were always glowing beneath a simple sign bearing the name Monroe Foundation. Ronan had established the foundation to help families with low incomes pay their medical bills and named it in honor of her parents, so no sister would ever again have to go hungry to care for a sibling, and no mother or father would ever have to watch a child lose a chance at life because of a financial assessment. But the greatest gift of her return was waiting inside an old envelope. On the first evening after she arrived at the apartment, Ronan and Piper were waiting with the old shoebox resting in the center of the table. Piper took out the envelope bearing the uneven words, "Tessa's Dream Fund." The envelope Tessa had never opened because she had spent years believing her sister was saving to buy some little toy. Piper placed it in her hands, and when Tessa opened it, she found crumpled bills of every denomination, spending money, holiday gifts, and change left over from cups of milk, all carefully smoothed and arranged in neat stacks. With her voice breaking, Piper said, "I started saving this the year I understood why you didn't go to college. You gave up school because of me, so I saved for the day you could return. I was always afraid I wouldn't live long enough to give it to you. Thank goodness I finally did." Tessa gathered her sister into her arms and cried as though she had never been allowed to cry before. The tears she believed had run dry when she was 20 years old now poured down without restraint, because it turned out that throughout all the years she had silently carried the entire world. A pair of smaller shoulders had been silently carrying her. Several days later, Ronan invited her to the 40th floor, and when she reached the familiar office, she stopped. The heavy wooden door was still there, but the lock had been completely removed, leaving only a patch of unfinished wood where it had once been. Ronan stood in the center of the sunlit room and told her that the door had once been locked against the entire world, that she had once opened it without needing to knock, and that she had later closed it from the outside. So that day, he had removed the lock forever, because he had nothing left to hide from her. Not a room, not a dark corner, not a single part of himself. Then the man lowered himself onto one knee and opened a small box. Inside wasn't a diamond, but a simple silver ring worn smooth by time. The ring that had belonged to his mother when she was a waitress at Rosaria. He asked whether Tessa would walk beside him through the rest of their lives as two equals holding hands, neither shielding the other, but facing everything together. Through tears and a smile, Tessa said yes. And the ring of a woman who had once faded away in silence now rested upon the hand of a woman who had learned to live aloud. Their story ends there, and perhaps it leaves us with something worth remembering. The emergency room that year didn't create their love. It merely made their silence impossible to continue. To love and respect another person doesn't mean solving everything for them. It means trusting that they are strong enough to face life beside us. Because the most precious gift we can offer someone we love isn't a road already laid before them, but a hand held tightly and one sincere question. What do you want? Only then can every person live fully within a life chosen by their own heart. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so we can continue listening to more meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And which moment moved you most deeply? Please write your thoughts in the comments so we can hear what lies within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.